All right, welcome everyone. We are so happy to welcome you here to the second part of season 3 of NCFS Unbound, and to the first session of 2023. Today, we are delighted to welcome Melanie Conroy, who will be discussing her new book, the literary geographies in Balzac and Proust, and she will be in conversation with Anne O'Neill Henry. I also wanted to thank my co-organizers, Susan McCready and Rachel Mesch, who unfortunately could not be here today. They are really amazing collaborators. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. Melanie Conroy is an associate professor of French at the University of Memphis. She's the author of Literary Geographies in Balzac and Proust, the book she's going to be discussing today. She's the co-director of the Salon project, a part of Mapping the Republic of Letters at Stanford University, where she received her doctorate, as well as the director of Mapping Balzac. She is a current member of the boards of H France and Centranet, and she was recently elected deputy treasurer of the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations. She will be in conversation with Anne O'Neill Henry, who is an associate professor of French and Francophone Studies at Georgetown University. Anne is the author of Mastering the Marketplace, Popular Literature in 19th Century France, published by University of Nebraska Press in 2017. Recent projects include guest editing a special issue of journal 19 on the Parisian Universal Expositions in fall 2020, and an anthology of popular literature from 19th century France, which she co-edited and co-translated with me. She's currently working on a book that looks at energy production, popular culture, and the Universal Expositions. And she also serves as book review co-editor for 19th century French studies. So welcome, Anne and Melanie.
Thank you so much. And so thank you, Masha. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone who's been involved with organizing this wonderful series. We've said it before, but it really is one of the best things to come out of the pandemic, as far as I'm concerned, because it's just really kept me going, especially seeing all of you from NCFS and then hearing about so many other fascinating projects. So to get started, I'd like to share a PowerPoint. I'm sorry, it won't be too much death by PowerPoint, but to show some of the figures from the book, and then we can launch into some more general questions. Okay. So it's a short book in the Cambridge Element series, and it's aiming to provide a sort of quick introduction to literary geography and digital humanities and how you use digital humanities for literary geography, with two examples, Balzac and Proust. And so this is coming from a digital humanities project that I've been working on for about the last 10 years, looking at like pulling the textual references of places that are referenced in Balzac and Proust, and then finding those on a modern contemporary GIS map. And that was something that I, thought might be a 2-year, maybe a 3-year project, but it ended up taking a lot more time than I thought, for reasons that we will get into a little bit today. So the first thing is to talk a little bit generally about what I mean by geography, the global, and GIS. And so geography obviously is an incredibly vast subject, but I'm specifically thinking in terms of global geography, so sort of the placement of cities and rivers on a contemporary globe, and then using digital humanities technologies to find GIS coordinates, so lat longs, in order to position these places on a modern satellite-derived image map of the Earth. And so this is a map that I spent too much time on. it's a little scary when you see, it's so simple, but oh, wow, that took a long time. So this is what I call Balzac's map of the world. It's the global locations outside of France that are referenced within Balzac, within the Commune Humaine. And so you can see that there's certain patterns that appear that, we all know that Italy and Greece and Spain are in Europe. And so if you heard those names or read them a lot, you kind of have a sense, okay, we're talking about Europe. But I do think that seeing them together on an actual physical map kind of drives home the extent to which, Balzac's map of the world is structured around Europe and specifically those countries closest to France. But it also draws attention to the fact that Balzac refers to many places, Siberia, China, Japan, that are not in Europe. And so I was quite surprised. I mean, we know that in the 19th century, there's a lot of Orientalist fiction. We know there's a lot of references to Persia and Egypt. But just seeing the extent of place references in the Americas, again, along the Eastern Seaboard, within Africa, did surprise me on a fair amount. On these maps, the size of the dot is the number of textual references. So a dot that appears very much larger, like Italy or Europe, has that proportional number of text references. And then those smaller dots, like for Australia or for Java, it means that within the totality of the Commune Humaine, there are fewer references to those places. So another example, so that's the map of the world. Another example, Balzac's Paris has been studied a great deal. And if anything, I think this is, in terms of geography, what we associate the most with Balzac. And so you can very quickly see, Père Lachaise, l'Opéra, la Bourse, le Palais Royal, these areas that get referenced so much, that characters visit, that are main plot points. But you can also see the diversity of other places, Passy, where Balzac lived for some time, and smaller locations that are referred to less often. But then you can go and through the interactive version, you can explore, okay, so when is this place mentioned? Is it associated with characters? Which books is it in? And then also, how many times it's referred to. So which book does it appear in the most? That sort of thing. Another example is the provinces. So for Balzac, one thing that's very notable is that he has a lot of references to historical places and what I'm calling non-historical places. But what I mean by that is that the name for a place appears on contemporary maps, because really what I'm working from here is the name. So Normandy, Versailles, these are places that appear on maps. That doesn't actually mean the maps are correct, nor does it mean that Balzac knows a lot about these places or that what he's saying about them is like realist or accurate or anything like that. But it's simply a reference to a historical place. So we can see that Balzac, being a native of Tours, he refers to a lot of places in that part of France, especially if you study like population maps from that time period. In the south of France, there's a lot more locations that could be mentioned, and that's sort of an area that he tends to underemphasize, especially compared to the West and the area around Paris and the Loire Valley. And then another similar map is the places that are non-historical. So many times they are associated with an aristocratic family, or they might be the mansion of a certain family, farms, things like that. But we can actually, with Balzac, not with every author, but with Balzac, we can often sort of see where they would be because there's a reference to a river, or it's saying sort of like, 30 kilometers out of Paris or something. So there's often like some kind of a reference, halfway between this city and that city. And then those things are referencing named places. So even when we're looking at the non-historical places, there's some kind of correlation to 19th century maps of the time. And so another area of exploration in terms of mapping and novels is non-cartographical visualizations. So I just have a couple quick examples here, but obviously, even if you're representing places in geography, there's a lot of other ways to do it than using maps. So examples, graphs, bubble lines, and grids. The bubble line diagrams, and sorry, the resolution's not great on this one, are very good at showing where in a text a place is mentioned. So instead of just saying, oh, Paris is mentioned 553 times throughout the entire text, you can actually see at what point in the text the place reference occurs. And so this can be really interesting, especially if there's kind of like a décalage between the setting and the narration, right? So a place is being referenced when it's not where the characters are. And another sort of more conceptually complicated diagram is the network diagram. And so in this case, the colored dots or notes are representing places, and then I've gone through and I've colored them according to where they are in the world, just to make that a little bit more legible. And then the gray dots are characters. And so anytime that a character is associated with a place or visits a place, they get one of these associative lines. And so you can see some places are not associated with that many characters. So Gomer with Hulot and Josepha, or any of the sort of outlying areas. But then the places that are found near the middle or that have larger dots or notes, those are places that are connected to more characters. And so using this network diagram, you can see both like which places get mentioned a lot. So Lorient, La Chine, Lézy. But you can also see which characters are associated with these places, and then you can kind of trace that through and say, okay, who else is connected with China? Who else is connected with India? So that's one way of exploring places that is not as used, I don't think, in literary studies, but it works very well with, concepts that we have about association and, the fundamental importance of where things are in a text and characters, as opposed to just, straight up counting how many times places are mentioned. And then finally, I would like to put in a little word about Proust. I know there's a couple of Proust scholars in the audience. So very quickly, basically I found, using the same method, going through and finding the textual references and then finding them on a map, that Proust is actually using kind of about the same proportion of places in Paris and outside of Paris. And he's also very likely to have provincial locations, places outside of Paris have fictional names. And then also for, other places in the world, tending to just use historical places. So not like inventing names for places in Egypt or something, which is totally a thing that some authors do. But obviously the importance of a place like Balzac or Conroy in the narrative is so much more. And so, by using those non-historical places, it's clear that Proust is trying to put a layer between, historical geography and his literary geography that I think in a lot of ways Balzac is trying to efface, even if some of his, historical geographies are a little bit suspect. So that's the project as a whole. There is, so the data is on mappingbalzac.org, I think. And then the book is available in a lot of libraries. It's a free ebook in a lot of academic libraries. And then I also have the figures and data available on Figshare, and then Tableau. I am working on, the globe is pretty good. I'm still working a little bit on Paris. There's some stuff to clean up there. So a lot of these things are available freely online, and then also in like an interactive version. So you can click on specific characters or specific novels and be able to see like a subset of the data instead of just, here's all the references.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that fascinating presentation. And I agree with what Elizabeth just said in the chat. All of the graphs, the maps, everything is gorgeous. I'm so happy to be here to talk with you today about literary geographies in Balzac and Proust. It's such an innovative project that I've enjoyed hearing about at previous NCFS conferences, and I think it really functions as a model for scholars in how to understand the complexities of place references and settings in literature, and just also more generally as a model for doing this type of digital humanities project. So thank you. Before we jump into the kind of arguments of the book, I just wanted to start by asking if you could talk a little bit about the series that it's published in, the Cambridge Elements in Digital Literary Studies.
Why, yes, I think my editor would like that. And actually, he was great to work with. Yeah, it's sort of like a short book that it's kind of born digital. It's first digital, and so most of the distribution occurs through their ebook platform that many research libraries are signed up for. And so it's sort of shorter books that are hopefully readable. I guess I shouldn't call my own book readable, we'll see, but are hopefully readable. And so advanced undergraduates or people who, graduate students, maybe in like English or Italian or something, would be able to just pick it up and read it without, going through a ton of references about, about like 19th century French studies. So it has to be sort of speaking a bit to a broader public, but I had a really good experience with them, and they have a number of different series about publishing and theater and performance that might interest people in this audience, even in terms of publishing something.
Nice. And one thing I noted throughout my reading was that you have to use the term element versus book.
Yeah.
So the element, I should say's title is Literary Geographies in Balzac and Proust. And you mentioned this a bit in your presentation, but can you talk about literary geography, and in the book you mentioned that it's a quote topic rather than practice or method. So could you just kind of lay out for us what you mean by literary geography and how this term is different from something like setting or other spatial concepts? And then also there's another term that you're working with, literary cartography, if you could explain kind of how that differs.
Great, yeah. So what I actually would say I'm doing in this project is literary cartography. So I'm really drawing maps of places. And so, part of the question is like, really, what is the point of doing that, right? Because literary geography is something we've all been doing for a very long time, right? Like we know which country the novels we're reading are supposedly set in. The whole idea of like fictional worlds being worked on in science fiction is an enormous aspect of literary criticism. So I would say many literary critics do literary geography, right? And there's not really any, it's not a new idea to do literary geography, but literary cartography is something that has been done less and is more common in digital humanities. And so I think it's kind of an open question, what the value of that is. And I wanted to sort of, question even, for example, counting places versus just being aware of what the setting of a novel, like what is the actual value of counting those places? What is the value of mapping those places? And yeah, I do not consider those to be settled questions within literary studies, but I do personally believe that literary cartography has a lot to offer.
And you're building on models of literary cartography that have been done before, right? Can you talk about some of the kind of models that you're building on? And you even talk about in your book about working with kind of pre-internet, pre-software models as well, right?
Yes. So the first one everyone always says to me is Franco Moretti, right? Who both did a lot in 19th century studies and then also working on Balzac, right? So, but actually there's a long tradition in France of literary cartography. And so Guy Chauvet actually had done a lot of the actual sort of cartography that Moretti uses in his work. And then, even in the 50s and 60s, all of these repertories, right, and atlases. So that was one of the reasons that I wanted to work on Balzac and Proust, because they both have a substantial literary critical apparatus that was developed, in the 1890s and the 1920s. And so in some ways I can compare my kind of the aspects that are computer generated with more traditional scholarship. But yeah, that's I would say they're two of the authors for which more of that work exists.
Yeah, that makes sense. And my question was going to sort of be like, next, why did you start with Balzac? But you've answered that. So thinking about Balzac's map of the world, which you showed us, what does the map of the world look like? You showed us visually what that looks like, but what kind of inferences did you then make from the mapping?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious, like, where's Antarctica? And then me not being a geographer looking back and saying, okay, it was actually kind of mapped in like the 1820s, 1830s. So the maps that Balzac was using probably didn't have Antarctica on them. The west coast of the Americas is virtually absent. So I think I mean, Africa and Australia are very much underrepresented. So it gives you a quick idea of, Balzac's biases, the pieces that are missing, and then we can go back and say, okay, to what extent are those shared 19th century biases, and to what extent are this just his weird predilections that he's not, interested in Africa. But there's that. I mean, looking at the outliers, the missing places, the weird places that get mentioned that you wouldn't really expect, and then also the extreme kind of concentration of certain places in Europe, or Italy is extremely prominent. And then sort of looking through those, like, why are these here? And it turns out a lot of, especially Eastern Europe is associated with Napoleonic battles. So you can see the influence of, like, war and colonialism in, like, for example, which places in Eastern Europe, which places in Northern Africa get mentioned a lot.
Right, and this is one of the best parts of the book, I think, where you mentioned that the maps of his world are very coextensive with the movements of French troops during the Napoleonic Wars, and then later the early colonization of North Africa. So this is totally fascinating to hear about, because I think when we think about mapping Balzac, we think about, of course we think about Paris, we think about the provinces, especially, Tours or Angoulême, for some examples, but I really appreciated how you kind of separated those out into different parts of the book. Of course, I have to talk about Paris, and you mentioned in
You're
your
probably
talk
going to ask me something I don't know. Yeah, I'm getting scared.
Just that if there's one of these spaces in Balzac that's been frequently mapped, it's of course Paris. And so the first thing I wanted to ask you about was, in terms of doing your project, just kind of in a nuts and bolts way, how does the fact that Haussmann changes large swaths of the Paris that's depicted in his work kind of complicate the process of mapping Balzac's Paris for you?
So much. So that was one of my major miscalculations, was that Paris could, 6 months, right? No. And so when you're using the technologies, so first of all, I do manually review all the references. So if something says it's China, I go in and look and say, okay, is this like China the country, or is this like China the dish, right? But then also looking and making sure it's actually, the place it's putting it in China is somewhere that I would consider to be a good, location for what Balzac would think of as China. Individually reviewing those is very important, but when you're doing something like the global map, and it's like Italy, China, software has almost no problem doing that, right? Because we have pretty agreed upon ideas of, like, where Italy is. But then for Paris, of course, because of Haussmannization, all of the street names have changed. Sometimes it'll be number 4 of this street, but that's actually a different place. You'll have a historical palace that now shares a name with a hotel, and so Google put it in Google, and it's like, oh, it's right here. And you look back, no, this is completely in the wrong quartier, but it's just got a similar name. So basically for Paris, I had to sort of hand investigate all of them, and there's some that I'm still working on. Like I'm not exactly sure where every single store that Balzac mentions is supposed to be, because it's referring to a street that is not currently listed. Okay, was that a street at the time? There are a huge number of really great encyclopedias working on things like, traditional historical street names in Paris. And I mean, Paris must be, one of the most documented cities in the world, along with Rome, for this kind of thing. Like this street has become that street. But it's Balzac's map of Paris is so detailed that there's things that even with all of these encyclopedias, I'm still not 100% sure where they're supposed to be. So it's it's both changed my view of just how deep Haussmannization was, and then also, it makes me aware of how much cultural knowledge we have that Balzac's readers would have gone, oh yeah, I know where that, tiny little arcade is. We all know where that tiny little arcade is, right? And it made me much more aware of like the things I don't know about Paris.
Did you learn anything, in addition to this, did you learn anything that was new or surprising to you about Balzac's Paris?
So the one thing I focused on, which isn't particularly new to Balzac scholars, is just that he loves areas of mixing, right? So this is something Masha's talked a lot about with transportation, but he loves things like the Palais Royal, where you have different social classes coming together. So in some ways, I think I kind of proved that thesis by finding those places like the Bourse and the Palais Royal and being able to say, okay, these really are, places that are mentioned a lot. And then, on top of that, seeing that those are so concentrated, right around the Palais Royal, I think, it's not shocking, but it was something that, I was surprised by the extent to which, his Paris references are all sort of very close to each other, or not all, but like many of them.
That's really interesting. So one thing that I love about your book is the section on network graphs and bubble lines. You kind of talk a lot about how these visualizations, instead of just showing on a map where things are and the frequency with which they're mentioned, they also kind of reveal patterns in these literary works. And so I was really struck how you spoke about how some of these mappings expose kind of gender differences among place references or class differences among place references. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the big one that I focused in on, because it was very striking, was, the older male characters having so many place references. So when I went and I listed all the places and who the characters are associated with, I kept, okay, who's got the most place references, right? And so like how many network connections do they have? Who's connected to the most places? Who has the most connections? Those are like slightly different ideas. And it kept kind of coming back to these military men like the Colonel Chabert, or to merchants, so Gobseck and Charles Mignon, people like that. So it was very strongly gendered in terms of which characters had the most place references, especially to foreign places. And then it was also, there's such a predominance of like military and like merchant figures, which makes sense, right? I mean, these are the cliches of the 19th century that, the man is going out exploring and conquering, and the woman's, staying at home in her domesticity. But that was even reflected in, analogies, like which places does a person get compared to? And there's so many famous examples of Balzac and Orientalism and, Paquita Valdez and stuff, like characters who are feminine and associated with the Orient, that actually, kind of surprised me.
And this is just as a follow-up to that, you mentioned in one part of the book the kind of complicated nature of mapping the Orient, or mapping or terms that were difficult to place on a modern map, the question of les Indes, which sometimes aren't even necessarily, it doesn't specify with what he's talking about. So can you talk a little bit about the challenges in mapping those areas?
Yeah,
especially,
and that's something like
if
you look at my map of the world, I mean, tell me I'm wrong, right? Like Lorient, where is that, right? So I kind of put it more in the Middle East, because I'd sort of like look through many references and say, okay, he's saying Lorient, I think he basically means the Middle East here. Ooh, this one's not as clear. But at the end of the day, that's one of the problems with the modern geographical system with GIS, is you do need to pick like a quadrant, right? You don't need to say like, oh, it's this one little dot, but it needs to be kind of sort of somewhere, or you have to have some crazy visualization of like uncertainty or something. So yeah, I mean, the Orient, obvious problem, if anyone knows where I should put it, I'd love to hear about it. And then the and really, I would go through, a lot of these character backstories where there's like a merchant who's been spending time in Les Indes. And sometimes it would say he was in a diamond mine. So you're like, okay, so he's in like Les Grands Indes, he's in like India, right? But then even sometimes the same character would, all of a sudden he's in Saint-Domingue. So then you're saying like, okay, did he earn money in both of these places? Or it's very difficult to say whether Balzac himself was confused or whether it was just kind of part of this broader cultural imaginary that like Les Indes is where you go to take financial risks and make money. But yeah, there's very strong associations, for example, Les Indes with money. And then the war in North Africa. There are certain places that basically, only exist in their relation to France and its empire. So it's one of the more troubling things that came out of the project, and it's something I haven't had time to fully work through. But there's a lot of negative aspects to many of these associations and to things that Balzac says about these places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in the book, you make this distinction between experienced places and referenced places, and then historical places and non-historical places. And you make a really clear point of not thinking of place in terms of real versus fictional. So I was just wondering if you could explain kind of the differences between experienced and referenced, historical, non-historical, and just say why this kind of model of thinking was productive and most appropriate for you.
Yeah, so experienced, I was kind of struggling for a word there too, but I wanted to talk about, character experience. So does the character go there? Do they want to go there? Do they have some kind of like relationship with this place? Or is it she was beautiful like a woman of the Orient or something, where it's just purely a reference? And so I tried to exclude things that, if it was if it's China, right, or the character Aziz, right, that's clearly not a place reference at all. But some of these place references are just sort of, saying like, this is the sort of thing people would do in Africa. This is the kind of decoration that Chinese people have. And so I wanted to kind of demarcate character experience and traveling places and, plot points that happen versus like, essentially analogies. A lot of those are analogies. And then the historical, again, I'm just working from names. So I would love to talk about fictional versus non-fictional, but because I'm just working with the names, it's really hard to say, is Balzac's Paris fictional or is it non-fictional? Because there's a lot of non-fictional stuff going on there, and like the characters are mostly completely fictional. And so to get away from labeling something as nonfiction and it turns out to be essentially fiction, I decided to just purely go based on names. But I think, that would be, working out whether the portraits of those places are actually realistic or detailed. I think that would be another, great project for me in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, this question of mapping historical versus non-historical places is a good segue maybe to switch to Proust, because you showed us again the wonderful graphics from Proust's map of the world and Proust's map of France. And I'm just wondering, you talk about in the book how the two authors rely on a similar set of tricks and architectural techniques to build a geographical structure for their characters to inhabit, but also that Proust's geography stands in contrast to Balzac's literary geography. So can you talk a little bit about the main differences between mapping these two authors? And I know in the book you argue that they actually do end up having some similarities. So if you could just walk us through a comparison of the two, that would be great.
Well, Proust, it's a lot less references, so I enjoyed it a lot more. That was probably a 6-month project, so that's that's always great. But it's again, this question of like, is if characters in Proust go to Venice, are they going to Venice or are they going to Venice, right? And so sometimes like descriptions of cities could have like a cathedral or a square that is known to exist. But then, first of all, I mean, they could, be like Conroy or Balzac. They could be, descriptions of things that seem very much like French things of the same time period that are in Normandy or in other parts of France, but then they can have like a, fictive name, right? Is that what fiction is? That seems like a really bare bones definition of what fictionality would be. But then, even in Balzac, as Graham Robb has shown so well in Discovery of France, there are a lot of descriptions of provincial towns in Balzac where there's a historical name and it's kind of sort of in the right location, but they're in the Alps and they seem like they're doing things that you would be doing in Brittany. So, I think that I was basically trying to make the smallest possible claim in terms of like the historicity and the realism of the places themselves, and just, make that claim on the name, because I just, I wouldn't want to make that claim about, the people that Balzac portrays were really like this or something like that. I think it's something he's trying to project, right? And so with Proust, I think the major difference is that Proust is not trying to project that sense that he's using maps in order to construct all of his train lines and, where the various towns are. And in fact, he's interjecting, town names that really don't make any sense. And he's not going and consulting the map in order to figure out, what would seem realistic to somebody who looked at the map. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different approach. And I feel that it's, it's very rhetorical. It's very intentional, but it's, at the end of the day, they are using similar strategies in terms of, mixing up historical and fictional names in order to create this like, semi-historical, historically grounded-ish place mm-hmm. with a lot of fictional elements.
Right, and you talk about them kind of both being on two ends, the separate ends of poles, right? With like you're saying, Proust definitely being on the poetic end, right? And I loved what you talked about in terms of the train and how eventually you came to realize the impossibility of trying to map this train, right? That
I'm not the first person to notice that. Yeah, no, yeah, I'm not the first person to notice that.
Just in the context of literally
I discovered it again, right? Like, yeah,
right. Yeah. So I'm starting to see some questions show up in the chat. And so a few of them touched on things that I was going to ask you. So I'm just going to jump to my last two very short questions. And then I think we'll move to the questions in the chat. I was curious in terms of pedagogy and how have you used any of these graphs or any mapping software in your classes when you've taught any of these literary texts? And what has the experience been like with that?
Yeah, so these maps I'm making them on Palladio, and so it's this underlying data, but I'm visualizing it on Palladio, which is really good for books, for producing books because it creates a very clean maps. But for teaching, I use Google Maps a lot. I mean, it's interactive. It's something they have access to, and then on top of that, like you can kind of like drop in, right? So you can drop into Versailles. You can show what it looks like to walk around a museum. So I always feel like for teaching the interactive and more immersive things they really land with the students, I think, in a way that like the statistical stuff doesn't as much.
It's true. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book, though, that's kind of complicated is the kind of how to explain how, by visualizing, the distance between Paris and Versailles, for example, on the map now, when we have the metro and the RER, it kind of obscures what it meant historically to get from Paris to Versailles under such different conditions. So do you ever talk about that with your students or?
I don't think so. I think about that a lot, I think about that a lot. I mean, I think the whole question of travel is just a whole other, like travel times and stuff. It's fascinating. And yeah, that is, yeah, I have not done that.
It's always complicated when I ask students, like, how long did it take you to get out to Versailles? And then we talk about what it meant, in 1789 versus now.
Oh, that's a fun activity. Yeah, that's really fun.
So just one final question for you. Do you have any, I know you mentioned that you're still kind of finalizing some of these graphics. Do you have any future projects either related to this, or are you moving on to map other authors, or what can we look forward to?
I'm still working on the interactive versions. Like, I really want to make it so that people who work on Balzac can go and pick a novel or a character. And for Paris, that's not done yet. So that's like the first thing. And I know that this isn't going to be something that like thousands of people, are going to be using, but I've had some contact from students. Well, I don't know, but I've had some contact from students who are working on these very precise things, right? Like, you're trying to work, like, where is this? And so trying to get that together and then just online, so that if, in 3 years, somebody's saying, whoa, which novels mention the Palais Royal? I'm working on the Palais Royal, right? That's available. Because I think a lot of these kinds of projects, I was telling you, I've been looking at stuff from the 1920s and the 1950s that has not been consulted that much. Mm-hmm. So, it's, the internet provides us with a really good way to make that accessible to, the kind of random weird person who decides that this is, what they want to be working on. And so just trying to like get this all in like a usable format for different kinds of users. And then also, helping if anybody else has Balzac maps they want to produce. That's kind of step one.
It's so great, Melanie, and it's such a great resource for everyone too. So I know we're all grateful. I wanted to go first to Elizabeth Emery's question, because she had asked specifically about what kind of programs you use for your maps, and she asks, do you use I guess it's ArcGIS or Story Maps? You mentioned Palladio, but I'll let you respond to Elizabeth's question.
Yeah, so for the networks, yes, I use Gephi. There's more complicated software, but it's easy out of the box, open source. And then I use Palladio for the books, but then Tableau is actually where I would like to end up, because, and so that's where I'm kind of developing the interactive stuff, because you can have an interactive map that, people can come and say, oh, I just want to see this. So I think they're all good for different things. Tableau has a free version, Gephi is free. Google, the problem is, as I was saying, it's really cool for class. And so you can go and, drop a couple pins and use that with your students. And it works so well, but they are really funny about copyright. And they even want to copyright their, like, this is our Paris, like the geographical coordinates. So using Google for publications is difficult. So if you were doing something like this, I would recommend using something in the open source for anything that you want to publish.
Great. So I will next go to Abigail Ray Alexander's question, who says that this conversation makes her think of a metaphor elaborated by Tristan Garcia in L'Architecture du Possible, in which he states that some thoughts are like maps and other thoughts are like compasses. He means that map-like thoughts help us arrange a field, while the compass-like thoughts help us direct our course, often by prioritizing some element over the other. Does this map/compass relationship come into play in your work, and or make you think of any other part of your work you'd like to share with us? So is there a map that comes to mind as being perhaps more affected by the compass thought inspiring its creation?
No, but I love that. So I'm going to start using it. That's a great metaphor. So actually, that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the experience places, like, places that help you, orient the character versus just the overall map, because it's a really big difference, right? Focalization, character focalization, that matters to us as literary critics. We don't want to just give that up and say, oh, it's this God's eye view all the time. So no, I love that. And yeah, that's, I would love to be doing more of the, compass work and compass visualization. So I will be using that.
Well, thanks, Abigail. And then Francois had a question. I think we got a little bit onto this at the very end about Proust. So he wants to know more about the localizing fictional places. In the case of Proust, it seems you had Combray located where the real Yé is on a map, and Balbec as Cabourg, where the novel, whereas in the novel, their location is often ambiguous or even contradictory. So.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, a lot of the Proust maps are kind of nonsense, right? Like I have 2 of the train and they don't work. So like that is part of the point. But then no, absolutely. I think that's another, project to get working on soon. And I've had this feedback, in a lot of different versions, and it's really important and very good. For Proust, right? The whole project of geolocalization, like putting it on a dot, is kind of problematic because he said this is Cambrai, this is this is not Illier, so you can't put it there really. But because it's a map, you have to put it somewhere. And so actually that is one thing I'm definitely working on, is to do a better Proust map. I used to use the term non-geolocalizable places, but then I'm creating a location for them. So certainly I need to conceptualize this better, but there are just certain places that either move in the text or that can't really be placed on a map in a responsible way. So I don't know, I'm thinking about using different colors or a different layer, like maybe it's some of them are transparent or something like that. But that is absolutely something that I want to do is to produce some kind of interactive Proust map that gives you an idea of the certainty or uncertainty and the extent to which the names are historical. Because yeah, the fact that it's a printed book, it had to be, it can't be multi-layer or 3D or anything like that. So it was a little bit of a limitation.
Well, we still have a little bit more time for questions.
So yes, thank you so much, Melanie and Anne, that this has been fantastic. And we can just open the floor to, live questions. And if you want to ask a question, you can, I think everybody can probably turn their cameras on and but not your microphones, and then, raise your hand or, just jump in with your question. I have a question. And I'm sorry if I missed that somehow, but can you talk about a specific assignment that you would give your students using the map? What would you ask them to do in relation to a specific text that you are studying with them?
I think tracing a character's path is really cool. Again, and you can do Google Maps with that, just to drop pins. And so say, okay, go Google Maps, say create my own map and just drop pins where they are. And even just to then have the students try to figure, okay, where's the Palais Royal, right? It kind of depends what level is this course. But yeah, I think following a character, and especially if you give people minor characters, if they get the protagonist, you could be there all day. But if they have a minor character or I have the places categorized by residence. And so, they could just put all the maps in a specific novel that they were reading, all the stores, or, all of the salons or something like that in a text that they're reading. And then they can easily show it to the rest of the class and say, oh, look, this is where she goes, right? Because a lot of us as French scholars, we have a sense of where Père Lachaise is, but do our students know? I think that's an exercise that kind of shows what they do know and what they're still working on.
Thank you. And so would they be expected then to do something with this information or, take it a step further, or the exercise is about mastering the Parisian topography and learning,
yeah, I definitely would say something what does this say about the character, or, the trajectory that they have in terms of plot, right? How does the plot trajectory interrelate with the places that they go to? And again, this might not be revolutionary publishable work, but I think knowing, how far it is between the Palais Royal and the Louvre, or the Opéra in the Bourse, it's important, as they're, French majors or if they're seriously studying French.
And also thinking, how much time would it take to walk? Because most of it is walking, right? So,
yes.
Something that takes 10 minutes now might have taken, an hour at the time. So,
I wish you could see like historical time on Google Maps. Like how long would that take historically, right?
Yeah, I think Corey Olson has a question. Yeah.
Oops, hi there. Well, as many of you probably know, I love Paris and I love maps. So I was very interested to hear this talk, and I love what you do in your project. And I was very much impressed or interested in your mention of Les Indes and everything, and how I wonder how realistic, or I don't know, like his geography is, because geography wasn't a subject that was really studied in the 19th century. And I'm sure his readers wouldn't care or may not know that a character goes from Les Indes or Le Grandin to Saint-Domingue, etc. So do you think this would be a tool that researchers could look at to see like how realistic his geography is? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I even think people who've really, worked these texts and who maybe, know the Balzac letters backwards and forwards, they can go and say, Melanie, that's wrong, right? Like we do know this because, he said that he thinks that all spices come from the Antilles. So like, because the problem is it's based on misapprehensions a lot of the time. And so going back and figuring out, like, it's easier to say, okay, this is wrong. And this is sort of what he's saying that's wrong, than like, why? Like, why is this wrong? Where is this coming from? And so, I think that's very much like a collective effort where, scholars who've really worked like Balzac in China could probably come and tell me a lot of things about why he's, talking about these places or why he's making mistakes, about a specific location. But I do think that having that all like visualized helps, because then people can say, Melanie, you put that in the wrong space. Whereas when we're all like imagining separately, there's a lot of space for us to just miss each other and not realize we're talking about something different.
No, and I wonder if like Proust, for example, is much more geographically accurate only because he probably would have studied geography, and then his isn't necessarily as global as Balzac's was. So, but thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for the talk, Melanie. I was wondering two things. One, how do you think this evolved in, say, if we think about Zola in the 19th century and his own kind of rewriting of, sort of literary references, but then also in a European context, how, during the Balzac time, lots of English writers were also coming to France and reporting back. So have you thought of doing comparison between English writers coming to Paris at that time and their own sets of references, thinking like Hazlitt and others, that might be interesting to sort of cross-pollinate in some ways your maps?
I do not know. So Anne works on Zola. We talked about this. So yeah, I have no idea. Like, so Zola doesn't actually have the same, like, there's not like one place you can go and find the geography. And so it's something I would have to do. And then in terms of the English, part of the reason I, proposed this as, somewhat controversial statement, Balzac is a global author, was in fact, because I would like people in English who work on these questions to say, he's not the first one, or, this is how things work in England. And there's certainly within British studies, a huge contingent of people who do literary geography. But yeah, I don't know. A lot of it in English is romanticism and poetry, like the Lake District project. A lot of it is poetry for some reason.
Yeah, and then the final point, if you haven't played with Dreamscape, one of the Voyant tool plugin, it actually helps you doing the visualization of the movement of the characters. So Stefan
really?
had worked on that in Jane Austen's novel, where you could trace the movement of characters with named places, and Voyant would basically physically show you across the map where the characters are, the little point, moving across. That was like one of the things he was working, just before he passed, but that's still around. So you can still, it's called Dreamscape. If you Google Dreamscape and Voyant tools, that there will be some references to that plugin to try to use Voyant in different ways to analyze text.
Well, that's wonderful. And yes, Stefan Sinclair, just amazing. I mean, the bubble line visualization that I showed was something that he produced. Yeah.
Minutes, but let's first thank Melanie and Anne for this wonderful, really fascinating conversation. And thank you, Melanie, for writing the book. I'm sure we'll all be, using your maps in our classes and further research.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne.